else who's joined. Ooh, I've got French subtitles. I don't know if anybody else has French subtitles, but we'll leave it alone. Okay, so I've just titled this Using Y-DNA and Autosomal DNA to Break Down Enslavement Brick Walls, because that's what I did in this particular scenario. So for starters, there's some terms I'd like to cover. For those of you who may be at the beginner level, you'll hear me using the term atDNA. That's just short for autosomal DNA. That DNA is present across all 23 pairs of chromosomes. You can find autosomal DNA matches on the sites where the person is tested or where they've uploaded their raw DNA file to. Autosomal matches can be close family members, or it can be people who share common ancestors as far back as 8 to 12 generations. So within the past 300 years or even more recent. So you'll hear me talk about Y-DNA. Y-DNA is present along the 23rd chromosome for genetic males only. It's passed only from father to son, and it consists of two parts, STR markers and SNPs. And I won't get into the details on STR markers or SNPs, just because I want to present just a really high level overview for now. But Y-DNA testing is a test that's available, again, only for genetic males. And then depending on the test, you can identify a haplogroup or STR markers, or you could also identify SNPs as well. Test takers can view Y-DNA STR matches with a genetic distance of 0 to 4 on a site such as familytreedna.com. That would show you if you share a recent ancestor with that person within the last 30 generations or more recent, so roughly 750 years or more to the present time. Anyone who does use some of the tools that I will talk about later on to identify their ancestors' haplogroup can view the Y-DNA tree of mankind. There are public trees available on familytreedna.com or the Y-Full site. You can view your descent from other haplogroups that are higher than yours. Oops. You can view your descent from other haplogroups who are ancestors of your haplogroup. And you can go all the way back to the Y-DNA atom. Spencer, will you be able to mute folks? But you can view your Y-DNA ancestors all the way back to Y-DNA atom, who lived over 200,000 years ago. You may also hear me use terms such as matrilineal or patrilineal. For this, since it's Y-DNA, I will focus on patrilineal, but matrilineal is the same concept. Patrilineal is your father's 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 line all the way back to Y-DNA atom. And on the flip side, matrilineal is your mother's 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 line all the way back to mitochondrial Eve. You'll also hear the word haplogroup. Haplogroup is essentially, you just boil it down, it's just a fancy word for an ancestor or ancestor group. It can help you identify where in the world your ancestor recently hailed from. And I put in parentheses recently because that's within the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. So autosomal DNA ancestors versus Y-DNA ancestors. So these two images are from the Family Tree DNA website. On the left here is autosomal DNA. It comes from both of your parents to you. Of course, your parents got it from their parents, so all 4 grandparents are represented, and then great-grandparents are represented as well. So your autosomal DNA is a combination of all of those ancestors' DNA. Conversely, Y-DNA, and one of the reasons why I like using autosomal DNA in conjunction with Y-DNA is that it only comes from one line. So you know precisely which ancestor it comes from. So there's no guesswork involved. You don't have to find out if it's on the maternal line or the paternal line, or if it comes from great grandma or great grandpa. You know specifically which ancestor it comes from. So my journey, this was me back in 2010, 2011, 2012, until I think I had my father test 2015 on Y-DNA. So I was strictly doing paper trail research until we started doing autosomal testing on cousins in 2014. But the paper trail research led me to my 2 times great-grandfather, pictured here on the 1870 census and also the 1880 census, and his wife, Barbara. She's misenumerated here as Barley. It's actually Barbara Ann Morrison was her married name. Here is my great-grandfather, Daniel Morrison, who was one of their children. Sorry, I'm gonna have some background noise. But the paper trail research showed us here 1870 and 1880 that they were residing in Tishomingo County, Mississippi. These were their children. Those of who are familiar with researching know that on the 1870 census, there's no relation to the head of household listed, but on the 1880 census, it begins to list everybody's relationship to the head of household, which was still Tarleton Morrison. So we learned some, we got clues and different information from the paper trail research. Here we can see one of the children who was not residing in the household in 1870 was living here. This is one of my great aunts, Martha Morrison Lawhorn. She had married a Lawhorn, and her children were residing back in the house in 1880. There's her age. I've kind of cropped it so you can't see where everybody was born, but I've got some details that I was able to glean from these ancestors. Also using some of the process and steps that I learned from researching formerly enslaved ancestors. I did look for them on the 1860 census, 1850 census by name. They didn't exist by name, so they were more than likely enslaved. I looked at where the children were born. They were being born in Alabama. Tarleton and his wife were born. He was born in North Carolina. She was born in South Carolina. So I was gleaning different clues from both of them and from the children as well. Dr. Gates, on his show, he's always showing to look for former enslavers that live in the same county. Going home. See if I can go to the next slide here, if it's just frozen on me. There we go. So one of the people that I honed in on while also researching my ancestors was a man by the name of Archibald Morrison. He did reside in Tishomingo County on the 1870 and 1880 censuses. He wasn't that far location-wise from where my ancestors lived. He was Caucasian. I did research him on the 1860 and 1850 censuses. He did reside in Alabama. He did own one enslaved person who did fit the age range of my two-time great-grandfather. But for me, that was great. That was circumstantial evidence, right? So I had circumstantial evidence. I had clues that I gleaned from the census records for both my direct ancestors and for this man, Archibald Morrison, who I wasn't certain if we had a connection to him or not. I could see that both he and Tarleton were from North Carolina. I could see that they had both resided in Alabama at approximately the same time, since their children were born during the same time frames in Alabama. Then I could see that they both resided in Tishomingo County, Mississippi at the same time. I could see that Archibald owned one enslaved person fitting Tarleton's age and gender. And on the 1880 census, since the people were listed by what their relation was to head of household, I could see that George Morrison, who was my great-grandfather's younger brother, was listed. He was the only one listed ever on the 1870 or 1880 census as a mulatto. On the 1880 census, he was listed as a stepson to Tarleton. I asked one of my cousins about it. I said, does that seem like a clue? Or, he was like, no, I'm going to chalk it up as a mistake. But I kind of filed it away in my brain, just to research in the future. In researching George Morrison, I did find that he did change his name to Jack Lawhorn. Documented that there's 27 of his descendants who tested. They do match Tarleton's other children that Tarleton had with his wife. So that's fully documented. But he didn't seem like he was that partial to the Morrison surname. So that was just another clue that, maybe this was accurate, that he was a stepson. Martha Morrison had married a Thomas Lawhorn in Tishomingo. She likely met him in Alabama because he was from Alabama, and their children were born in Alabama. So I had all this circumstantial evidence, but I didn't have any concrete evidence. My problems that I felt that I had with the circumstantial evidence, number one, it's circumstantial, it's not definitive. I wanted something more concrete. Archibald also, because I was researching other former enslavers in Tishomingo, he wasn't the only Morrison former enslaver that resided in that county. So I couldn't really discount them as well, as possibly being affiliated with Charlton. Archibald only owned one person who fit Charlton's age. So my question was, where was Charlton's wife and his children? Who owned them? I could see where Archibald resided in Alabama, but again, my question was, where was Charlton's wife and children? Where did they reside in Alabama? I also had another question that was just there pressing, was George really a stepson to Charlton, or was that a census mistake? Why was he a stepson? But he was younger than my great-grandfather. Were the elder children, because my great-grandfather was out of the house in 1880, was he perhaps also a stepchild to Charlton? I had those questions that were lingering in my mind, and I wanted answers to them. So, autosomal DNA. So again, the journey for my family started in 2014. We started getting together and doing autosomal DNA testing. So I recruited cousin Willa to test. She descends from Martha Morrison Lawhorn. Obviously, I have my father test. He descends from Daniel Morrison. So Martha was born about 1850. Daniel was born about 1858. George Morrison, who changed his name to Jack Lawhorn, was born about 1860. I did find 2 of his descendants to test. And then we had baby brother, who was born after emancipation. And I have one of his grandchildren who's tested. So the problem with autosomal DNA is that you have ranges of autosomal DNA that can be shared. And so based on the amounts that were shared, so even when I look at my father compared to John Morrison here, they share 237 centimorgans of DNA. And here they are as second cousins, right? Well, 237 centimorgans of DNA can fall in either in the half second cousin range or full second cousin range. And remember, my question is, was Daniel really Charlton's son? How could I prove that? How could I know definitively? Because I can't go back and dig up my grandfather. I can't go back and dig up, John's father here to test. I can't get more concrete testing done. How can I find out if they were both Charlton's sons? I have to look at something other than autosomal DNA, and we wanted to start looking at Y-DNA. And so we also wanted to answer that question here about George Morrison. Is he really a stepson? So the answer to that is to Y-DNA test all 3 of these lines. So that's what we did. So here I've dropped off the Martha's line because she's obviously not a direct patrilineal descendant of Charlton. But here we've got the 3 lines that possibly are the direct patrilineal descendants of Charlton. Again, with this question mark, the biggest question mark here and here for me. What are their Y-DNA results going to look like? So these were kind of the research questions that I framed out. Was Charlton the father of George Morrison, who changed his name to Jack Lawhorn? Was he the father of Daniel Morrison, who was out of the house on the 1880 census and didn't have a relationship listed to Charlton? If he's not the father, who was the father? So those were my research questions going into Y-DNA testing. So Y-DNA results and answers. So Y-DNA, the STR markers and the haplogroup for both Daniel, who's an older brother, and then Marshall, who's the youngest brother, they match. They both have the EM2 haplogroup. More specifically, they have the EP252 haplogroup because I've used some of the free tools out there to find the more recent haplogroups. But more specifically, they match on 110 out of 111 markers, which means that within the past 5 generations, with a 92% probability, they share the same patrilineal ancestor. They also share autosomal DNA, either at the full second cousin or half second cousin level. So for me, that's a confirmation that this is accurate, that they match. They're both descendants of both Charlton and Barbara, especially Charlton because the Y-DNA matches. The middle son, he's the odd one out. So that was not a census taker mistake, like my cousin wanted to chalk it up, that nope, the census taker may have just put down stepson as an accident. He does have a different haplogroup that's off by thousands of years from this particular haplogroup. Not only does he have this different haplogroup, it is also a European haplogroup. So that matches the detail that the census taker put down that he was mulatto. Not only those first two items, he also has matches. We've upgraded him to the 67 marker level, and he has STR matches who have a variation of the Galbraith surname. So it's either spelled Galbraith, or it's spelled Galbraith, or it's spelled Colbraith. This was a surname that I had never heard, was not on my radar whatsoever. Did not hear this until we did the Y-DNA testing and I looked at the matches. But if you remember from this earlier testing here, and actually I'll go forward. I have his granddaughter who's tested. I have access to her matches on Ancestry.com. My research question now becomes, are there any Galbraiths in her DNA matches on Ancestry.com? So I go in, type in that surname in her matches list, and boom, she's got Galbraith matches. She's got strong Galbraith matches, 107 CMs here, 77 CMs, 67 CMs, 66, 64, right? When I go in and I look at who these folks descend from, these four individuals, there are the 2 times great grandchildren of a man by the name of Thomas Dan Galbraith. Now, mind you, again, I'd never heard this name. This was not on my radar at all. This person, she's the 3rd great grandchild of Thomas Dan Galbraith. So there's something up with this person, Thomas Dan Galbraith. So I start to research Thomas Dan Galbraith. I find out that he resided in the same exact county that Archibald Morrison resided in Alabama in 1850 and 1860, which is Marion County, Alabama. When I researched to find did he own enslaved people, I struck out. He didn't own any enslaved people in 1850 or 1860. But I noticed a telling detail as I was researching him. His wife's name was Elmira Rousum. Well, my 2 times great grandmother, on one of the documents we have from one of her children, from actually her baby son, Marshall, he spells her maiden name as Rousum, Rousom. So, what is, who is this? Now I want to research Elmira Rousum. I find out that her father is John Rousum, and Thomas and his wife Elmira lived a short distance from John Rousum, also in Marion County, Alabama. And as I researched John Rousum, I find out he did own enslaved people in both 1850 and 1860. And those enslaved people matched my 2 times great grandmother and her children. When I looked at a map, Misha had actually shown on the Kinkofa group on one of the What's Up Cuz meetings, a map where you could find the earliest landowners. And looking in Marion County, Alabama, John Rousum actually lived about 4 miles driving distance via modern day roads away from Archibald Morrison. So they lived nearby one another. This is actually the map that Misha showed. And here are some Lawhorns. We know that that Tarleton's oldest daughter married a Lawhorn. I have researched these Lawhorns. They were enslavers. Here's John Rousum on the township map. Here's Thomas Galbraith, his son-in-law. And here is Archibald Morrison. He's in the next section over. So this is a township 10S, and the range is 15W. Archibald lived in the township just below them. The interesting thing about this particular map is that you can actually view this link in Google Maps. You can use Map My Google to document, to actually put little links and pins of where these ancestors lived, and even do the modern day driving directions. But I see the close proximity of all of these particular enslavers and members of the enslaver family. So over here is where I've actually done the Map My Google and looked at the driving distance and dropped pins for these townships and ranges where these enslavers had land and where they're enslaved or working the land. So you can do this with all of your lines. I did this particularly with my 2 times great-grandfather, Tarleton Morrison. This is a screenshot of my cousin's pedigree. I've kind of cropped him off and just shown his ancestors here. He descends patrilineally from John Powell. So he's done a Y-DNA test. This is John Powell's haplogroup. But because he also descends from Tarleton Morrison, but he just doesn't descend from him patrilineally, he can take advantage of the fact that my father has done the Y-DNA test and that this is Tarleton's haplogroup. And he's got other cousins that we've recruited to do the Y-DNA testing. Not all of them are coming back European. Roughly 25 to 35% of Black American men who've tested are going to have European haplogroups. And men of European descent have tested at such a high rate on family tree DNA with Y-DNA that most people who have European haplogroups are going to have matches, like what happened with my Galbraith great-great-uncle. More men do need to test who have African haplogroups so we can begin to find the matches that we're finding with Europeans. And what has happened with my cousin, he also descends from this person here, Tom Jeff Martin. His patrilineal descendant is testing positive for a European haplogroup, and he even has Caucasian Gallagher surname matches. He's gone back to his autosomal matches and he found Gallagher's among his autosomal DNA matches. We've done the same thing with his Payden line, who the Paydens, the patrilineal descendants of the ancestors who owned Abraham Payden and where he got his surname from, actually had that descendant test years ago because they believed that Abraham was fathered by one of the Payden men. But it turns out he doesn't care. He doesn't match them on Y-DNA. He doesn't have Payden STR matches. He has Parrish surname matches instead, Caucasian. Same thing with Peter Alexander, who founded one of the towns in Tishomingo County, one of the Black towns. Everybody wanted to know who, he was listed as mulatto too, and it was rumored that his father was a white man, and who was his father. He's coming back to have Caucasian maize surname matches on Y-DNA. So without that, and again, on autosomal DNA and Y-DNA, we're finding that surname Mays, and it's even pointing to somebody by the name of Sterling Mays. So Y-DNA is actually helping us map out who the patriarchs are for some of these formerly enslaved people. So I know I've kind of rushed through things, but some of the things I want to leave you guys with, where to start and what to know, is collaborate with your cousins, collaborate with your matches, share your matches with other folks, join a project or start a project, whether it's on Family Tree DNA or just a Facebook group and a project of working together, collaborating together, finding the patrilineal descendants to test, sharing the information. What's a Y-DNA haplogroup? Is it coming back to surname matches or not? This process does work best with Y-DNA at this time. Y-DNA, you can narrow it down to a time frame with a degree of accuracy that the most recent common ancestor is. You can find surname matches. You can't do that as easily with mitochondrial DNA. But work to Asani, who's attending, who can tell you if your haplogroup is predominantly European or if it's African or another haplogroup. And the last thing that I just can't say it enough, is that we need more men who have African haplogroups to test so we can find the type of matches that we're finding for those who have European haplogroups. So Spencer wanted me to leave you guys with some homework. So for the next call, find out the haplogroup of your patrilineal line, and also don't just stop there. Find out that the haplogroups of some of your other ancestors. use that new family tree DNA tool to discover more about your haplogroup ancestor. And I've got the link here. And then if you haven't done Y-DNA testing, consider doing it. If you've done Y-DNA testing and only stopped at the 37 marker level, consider upgrading and getting to either a higher marker or going up to the big Y test. So with that, I'll pause for questions. I'm open to using, showing the tool live in action today, but I also have a video out there on using the YC Clad Finder tool. And then I'm also available for any questions if anybody wants to email questions to me. So with that, I'll pause and see, are there any questions that may have come in the chat, or if anybody wants to come off mute and ask those questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to find the unmute button, but
Okay.
so there's no way to use an ancestry kit for this tool, or does the site provide their own kit that a man would have to use?
Yeah, so since Y-DNA consists of both STR markers and SNPs, any genetic male who's taken an ancestry DNA test, they're looking at the 23rd chromosome and they've identified some SNPs. So that tool will actually read the SNPs on the 23rd chromosome and give you an output of a haplogroup. Just identifying your haplogroup is not going to identify matches. You'll need to do an STR test to be able to identify matches. But using the tool is a good step, because most folks don't even know, do I have a European haplogroup or do I have an African haplogroup?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I saw somebody ask if I'll put the link to the video in the chat. I will. So I'll pull that up while, does anybody else want to ask any other questions? Don't be shy, folks. Okay, I see Spencer says he's ordering the test now for the full information, precisely. Yep, the haplogroup is just the first step.
I think everyone is just amazed. So we're digesting the information, because again, this was amazing, and pondering how to use it next steps and for our next call, because we're all just like amazed.
Good.
Yeah, that really was that was great. It was, and that she just asked my next question: how long did it take to do all of this? But I've heard people kind of explain this, but your PowerPoints kind of showed and demonstrated what was happening. So I do appreciate this, and I do think it's amazing.
Good. Yeah, I was amazed. I mean, I was on this journey, right? And I had that question, and I would, ask my cousin, like, what do you think? What do you think of this? Do you really think that, he was a stepson? And it was easy. It was an easy thing to do, to chalk it up. No, it's probably just a census taker mistake, right? But that curiosity that fuels me being, into genealogy, I was like, how can I answer if it was a mistake or not, right? And Y-DNA was the answer. Once we got that, it was just the next logical step to go plug that surname into her matches, and boom, the answer was sitting right there. The confirmation, I've likened it to like a airplane runway with flashing lights leading right to the enslavers. Forget the circumstantial evidence. It leads you right to them. It's unequivocal, without a doubt, that's where they belong. Now, not all of them are that easy, right? So the Sterling Mays connection between Peter Alexander, that one is further back, and that one's harder to kind of figure out. But there's things to do to try to determine, because Y-DNA is not just going to answer everything, right? And Y-DNA doesn't always lead directly to the perpetrator, the man who was, the patriarch, right? It could just identify a bunch of brothers, and then you have to do extra work to figure out which one of those brothers was the father. In this case, that Thomas Dent Galbraith, the fact that there was at least 6 of his descendants who tested, and there's such a close match to my cousins who tested, it was just, the answer was sitting right there. Did somebody else have a question? I see that Stennis is off mute. I didn't know if it because he had a question or not. He went on mute. Dana, I saw you come off mute. Were you going to chime in?
Yes. So I have my brother's Y-DNA tested. I'm still waiting on, matches to help with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I know the haplogroup, but we don't have any close matches on that line.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have a cousin that's Y-DNA tested, and this is a line, he's been asking, the family's been asking for years, who really is our great grandfather's father. There's an oral history there. And it turns out it's a European haplogroup. But still, with as many as them in the database, we don't quite have a name yet. Because he's tested at 67 markers, there's no matches at that level.
Even with the European haplogroup?
Right.
Interesting.
Yes. And but down at maybe 37 or even the one before that, I'm seeing, many matches with a Saunders surname,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe a few with an Ingram. So I'm still not sure. So I'm still waiting on that, that key match to come in.
And what is the genetic distance to the Saunders matches?
At least one, I think. I don't think we have a 0 genetic distance match.
Well, the 36 out of 37 markers is not bad. And if you've got some genetic distance to a few Saunders on that, I would research them. Again, the answer didn't just come from me identifying the Galbraith surname, right? It also, I had to jump over into autosomal DNA, look for the Galbraiths under that. So you might want to check for Saunders in the autosomal results as well and start doing some triangulation there. Plus, I also had to research Thomas Dent Galbraith and find out more about him. And again, if I would have just stopped and said, well, he didn't own slaves, so it can't be him, then I wouldn't have arrived at the answer. Because I had to research his wife as well and found out that her surname matched my 2 times great grandmother's surname. So you just got to keep pushing, looking for other avenues that you can explore.
Right. So one thing I did do is I got this cousin on Ancestry.
Okay.
Since it's the bigger database. Because we just weren't getting those autosomal matches. I mean, he has autosomal matches on family tree DNA. And I could search those for Saunders, but those that were Y-DNA matches weren't close enough to be an autosomal match.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, okay, let's at least get you in the larger database and see what happens from there.
Mm-hmm. I saw another question I wanted to address too. Geraldine had asked, what do you suggest for those without access to families' Y-DNA? Geraldine, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Do you not have?
Hi, yeah. So hold on a second, my AC making some noise.
Okay.
So while I don't have, none of the family members on my paternal line are willing to test. And I don't know where I would go in order to find out what the Y-DNA is on that line. I've only tested with family tree DNA, but I heard what you said, that the mitochondrial won't help as much. So what is there left for folks who are in my spot?
Well, so one of the things you said is that they're not willing to test. Is it a cost thing for them? Have you assessed, are they not willing to test because they're not willing to part with that money? Or
I think it's I'm not as close with them, and there's a religious component in there.
okay. So I guess the first thing would be to assess why they won't test, right? Is it just a lack of education and uncertainty? And could you educate them on it?
I don't So, I mean, very recently, I mean, a few months ago, my half brother got in touch with me, and I think he was pressured to by our father.
Okay.
Because my mother recently passed away. And of course, me being interested in this kind of data was asking him, like, well, you know, I do this and it's very interesting. Have you tested? And he did come forth and said, yeah, I tested with 23andMe. And I think I've tested with Ancestry. And then I replied back and I'm like, oh, well, yeah, let me know where you are, who you are in there, because I'm not on those platforms yet. And I'm
Mhm.
like, if you are in any of them, let me know. I will get there. I will get that test and get myself on there. And that was the last time I heard from him.
So just persistence, right? So I'm very persistent in, you know, a lot of times the family members that I've approached, they won't give me an answer right off the bat. They say, you know, let me think on it, let me pray on it, let me get back to you. What I do at that point is, you know, okay, you know, that's just fine. Is it okay if I follow up with you in 2 weeks or a month or what have you, right? And I do ask those questions. You know, if cost is an issue, you know, we've taken up collections for folks. You know, there's a lot of cousins, there's a lot of Tishomingo descendants. So when I have somebody who says cost is an issue, we take up a collection of like $5, $10, $15 per person, right? And then we nickel and dime our way to the test. If he has tested already on 23andMe, the next 23andMe sale, take a test over there. You know,
Yeah,
you'll be
I
able
think
to
that's
see
what
his
I'm gonna do.
haplogroup. He doesn't need to share it with you. If he's a match to you, he's your half brother, and you'll be able to see his haplogroup. So then you'll have it, and you'll know that that's your ancestor's haplogroup as well.
But based on what I heard you mention, you say the haplogroup, even if you have it, won't assist as much as
It
getting
won't.
actual,
It's still better than nothing. Don't get me wrong.
right?
But it won't. But I would then use that, go out to the Discover Family Tree DNA, you know, tool, put together a report for him and tell him, you know, this is the report based on the haplogroup. Now, if you do this next step and this and that, you know, we'll get even more, and just get him excited about it.
I'm going to do exactly that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I'm looking to see. Spencer, do you see any other questions? And Dana, are there any questions on the Clubhouse?
I don't see any others on here.
I see. Hassani, what did you ask
Clubhouse.
that?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. So Hassani, what do you want to ask your question and elaborate on what you're asking? Can you do this if you've done an African ancestry test?
Well, yeah, that's my question.
So can you find out the matches the way that I did in my?
Yes. Can you
Yeah.
find matches to an African ancestry test?
Absolutely not. You cannot. They don't have a database of matches, and they're only testing at the 8 marker STR level. An 8 marker out of 8 marker match could be, you could share a common ancestor 20,000 years ago. So it would not be any help for you to identify somebody who was during, you know, the transatlantic slave trade, and the time of enslavement here in the US. So yeah, short answer, no. I don't even think you can get your haplogroup with the level of testing that they do with African ancestry. So you wouldn't even be able to use the free tool on Family Tree DNA. Let's see. I put the link to the video in the chat. Where did I freeze at, Dana? Because I want to know what was skipped when it froze.
I'm trying to recall. You weren't frozen for too long, but at least long enough for some of us to wonder, hey, what happened?
Okay.
I think
Well,
you were
what
just getting
I'll,
started.
Spencer?
I think you were just getting started, so it really wasn't anything major that we missed out on, because it was like a minute. It wasn't even a minute long, and a half a second,
Okay.
half a minute.
Cool. So Dana, my subtitles were probably in French because I was practicing. I have a group of Congolese who speak French. They're in France, and I was having them test. So it may have been when I was practicing with my Zoom to see could I translate, but I don't understand why. Huh?
I said, nice.
Yeah, it is nice, but I don't understand why it would have just changed my Zoom subtitles to French. So fun, joys of technology.
Can you speak a little bit towards your projects and then how we might help with that?
Sure. So, so obviously I fell in love with Y-DNA testing because that was like one of my first, out the park experiences with it. So I just kept expanding and realizing that, we need more people need a Y-DNA test because there are so many things to be gleaned from it. So I've expanded it from my Tishomingo descendants to Legacy Reclaimed, which is my nonprofit, and also the project that I have on Family Tree DNA that I just, in short, just realized that more descendants of enslaved ancestors need to Y-DNA test because you'll have some of those answers like, I had with the gallbreath that are just right there waiting to be discovered. And then to somebody else's point, I think Dana was talking about, she's waiting for matches on Y-DNA for the test that she's done. The only two matches, so my father's Y-DNA and his second cousin, John Morrison, they match each other, but they don't have any other matches in the database. So it helped me to confirm that they both descend from Tarleton Morrison, but I still can't get a generation past Tarleton. I can't go to his father and find Y-DNA matches along that line. So my project is just to educate on what can be done with Y-DNA, getting, the haplogroups for free, encouraging to take that next step and do STR testing and hopefully big Y testing, helping folks to understand Y-DNA and what a genetic distance is, what a haplogroup is and where theirs might stem from in recent times and so forth. So that's the scope of my project. It's incredibly broad. It's not just African Y-DNA or European Y-DNA, but specifically descendants of enslaved ancestors. As I mentioned, I am having, since I do have a nonprofit, I do have people donating money and testing so we can get more folks from the continent. Even if they're not there, they're in diaspora. So for example, in France or in Canada, et cetera, to test. So more Africans to test. So we can potentially find Y-DNA matches between enslaved ancestors, descendants of enslaved ancestors and Africans who know within the past few generations what ethnic groups and tribes they descend from, where at on the continent their ancestors are from, et cetera. So that's the scope of the project. It's really, really broad, unfortunately, but it'll narrow down as more folks join. So if you know people who are interested in testing, if you know people who have questions about Y-DNA testing, just send them my way. But I want to thank you, Spencer, for having me.
For doing this, Samantha. We really appreciate it.
No
Thank
problem.
you so much.